When did Star Wars die? I feel this question is a completely personal matter for someone like me who grew up with the original films. So this answer is going to be completely personal. Makes sense, right? And if it's taken offensively by anyone too young to have seen the original 3 films in the theater, so be it. This viewer was 8 years old when he saw the original Star Wars in the theater, and 13 years old when he saw Return of the Jedi on its opening weekend in 1983. The first Star Wars film was not referred to as A New Hope by its original fans because there was no expectation that the film would spawn sequels. We simply called it Star Wars. And it was simply enjoyed by us kids as a complete story in its own right. Of course, being elementary school-age kids, the scene in which Darth Vader spun off uncontrollably in his TIE fighter was a hint of an unfinished story that flew right past us. For us at the time, the destruction of the Death Star was the grand finale, and it was as grand as anyone my age had ever seen. By 1978, most everyone I knew, kid and adult alike, had seen Star Wars multiple times. I had seen it 4 times that I can recall, and even my baby boomer parents had seen it at least twice. Even my overly serious grandmother had seen it and loved it. Siskel and Ebert's 2 thumbs down review aside, I never met anyone who told me that they weren't a fan, or seriously impressed with one or multiple aspects of the original film. It was a sensation. All of the kids in my neighborhood either played with Star Wars toys or wished they were playing with Star Wars toys. The second film, The Empire Strikes Back, was further icing on the cake for us. And despite what seemed to be a slower story, the second film captured us with the revelation that Darth Vader was in fact Luke's father. And of course this had been a rumor circulating in magazines of the era, but wasn't believed until seen on the screen. There had not been a troublesome internet in existence to spoil the surprise for us. I'm going to assert, without reservation, that Star Wars, contrary to popular opinion, died a death of many cuts. Star Wars died long before the script for The Last Jedi was even considered, and certainly long before the franchise was sold to the Walt Disney Company. Furthermore, Star Wars was not killed by the likes of director Rian Johnson or by producer Kathleen Kennedy. The death of Star Wars was a gradual decay that began with one final scene, in the 3rd installment of Return of the Jedi. The eventual death of Star Wars was made inevitable by the mind of George Lucas, and the unchecked creativity of George Lucas alone. For in that one pivotal scene, George Lucas performed his very own shark jump, and that scene was a vicious cut to what could have been a nearly flawless trilogy. The first insidious cut to Star Wars was the moment the Ewoks began their celebratory dance and song number at the end of Return of the Jedi. This final scene of the film, unknown to many millennial-age viewers thanks to George Lucas's revisionism, was the lingering bad taste of comedy and an otherwise serious story arc, a jarring and emotionally incongruent moment dropped into the resolution of the battle between good and evil. That first cut was hardly noticed at the time, but I distinctly remember as a teenager sitting near the front row in my theater the disjointed moment when the goofy teddy bear-like creatures broke into song and dance. Today, we would call it a cringe moment. It was a moment I will never forget because, like many fans of my age, it was our first such cringe in this great space fantasy world we had grown up with. That first small cut would lead to many other cuts. I've asked myself and others my age over the years if it could have been that George Lucas had designed the Ewoks merely for toy sales, or if he had seriously considered them to be vital story elements. I've always leaned towards the answer of toy sales myself, but I suppose the answer to that question would only be known to Lucas himself. In at least one later interview, much later, following the release of The Phantom Menace, Lucas stated that Star Wars was made for children, a story about space wizards. Personally, I consider that an answer in favor of my toy sale theory. My personal belief is that George Lucas wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to design stories to sell toys to small children, But he also wanted to draw teens and adults into the theater, and certainly wanted adults with disposable income to buy everything from keychains to ball caps. The original Star Wars, otherwise known as A New Hope, was probably a one-off. Lucas was certainly not able to replicate that success, even with his later special edition revisions. In any case, the first cut was deep and memorable, and in the minds of fans my age, it was the small seed that would become the sabotage of any enjoyment of the next three films. The CGI fest known today as the prequel trilogy. To be fair, almost everyone my age that I knew in 1999 was eagerly awaiting the release of Episode 1, long before the public was informed it would be titled The Phantom Menace. Myself, I had forgotten about Star Wars, being 29 and concerned with adult matters. Like most my age, our movie and popular cultural interest was now more closely aligned to material like The Matrix and, of course, the many TV series and movies of the Star Trek franchise. When we first heard that George Lucas was going to make new Star Wars movies, we were naturally enthused, and our interest in Lucas's universe was reawakened. After all, nearly all of our childhood memories of Star Wars were perfectly nostalgic, except for that one small cut. That cut we couldn't quite identify because of the passage of time, but that we still felt like a vague and distant ache. In any case, I happened to see The Phantom Menace during its second week in the theater. I don't recall hearing anything other than positive hype of the film, and that would be thanks to the corporate media doing their jobs, and I took my seat expecting, perhaps even knowing, that I was in for a treat. Unfortunately, at less than 10 minutes into the film, I had a familiar and uneasy feeling. I wouldn't know it until much later, after some deliberate thought, but it was that same feeling I had felt at the final scene of Return of the Jedi. That old cut was still there. It was in those first few moments of The Phantom Menace that I realized I was watching a movie that was made for young children, even more so than the marketing had led me to believe, and certainly far beyond what other enthusiastic fans had expected as they had lined up in front of theaters for days in advance. 30-year-olds, for example, were dressed up as their favorite Star Wars characters, camped out in portable tents. Now, of course, I was aware that this was going to be the story of Anakin Skywalker, who was supposed to be a child at this point in the Star Wars mythology. But I was not expecting a childlike story structure or cringy droid humor during what was supposed to be life-threatening combat. The tension that had made the original Star Wars a fantastical hero's journey was completely absent in The Phantom Menace. It was obliterated in its entirety by the first fart joke featuring Jar Jar Binks, and what remained of the adult-geared atmosphere and somewhat gritty realism of the original trilogy was completely vaporized by large boring chunks of obvious CGI scenery, some of which that CGI was so cartoonish in The Phantom Menace that it could have been a Disney movie already. Little did we know. As The Phantom Menace progressed, there were long, boring scenes of exposition. Characters walked slowly from place to place and sat on all manner of couches and lounge seats to talk. I remember wondering during my first viewing in the theater if George Lucas was boring me to death because he wanted to prove how much he loved CGI, or if he really didn't know how to move the story forward in a better way. Thinking back on it in the past few years, I've concluded that it was probably some of both. But somehow Lucas thought that millions of dollars of computer animation gimmickry would make up for his laziness. And I say laziness because George Lucas's own documentary on the filming of The Phantom Menace seems to show him spending most of his time sitting back in a chair while teams of people directed the actors in front of massive green screens. I'm thinking that all of the computer wizardry was meant to replace the team of people whom had kept him on the right path during the first and second movies. In my opinion, that plan did not work out so well. As it turned out, I had no interest in seeing Episode 2 or Episode 3. I didn't see them in the theaters, and I didn't even see them at all until I ran across each one on various movie channels. Like most people my age that I've spoken to, I would consider Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith to be the best of the prequel trilogy. But the point I'm trying to make is that I would rather not consider any of them at all. In my mind, Star Wars: The Perfect Fantasy Adventure Story ended when the second Death Star exploded, before the appearance of the singing and dancing Ewoks. I've had the misfortune to see a YouTube clip of George Lucas's revised ending of Return of the Jedi, and it hasn't helped matters. The revised scene merely seems to be replacing one set of bad decisions with another set of bad decisions. George Lucas has proved to me that he killed Star Wars. It was his baby, and it was his baby to kill, whether it was in the name of toy sales or simple bad storytelling choices. The sale of Star Wars to Walt Disney merely exposed the franchise for its dysfunctions. J.J. Abrams is certainly a competent director, despite the negative pushback from many online critics. However, even the greatest director being handed a fandom that would be near impossible to please had an uphill battle. Lucas had already done the fans dirty by many accounts, so I can see how Disney's best efforts would have been quite a risk. Abrams chose to play it safe and create The Force Awakens as almost a soft reboot of A New Hope. It followed the same beats, swapping a female character in place of Luke Skywalker, and it even blew up a bigger and more powerful version of a Death Star. This was the ultra-safe approach, the running scared approach in my opinion. Disney may yet find a successful direction for Star Wars, one which pleases both children and adults and continues to sell plenty of merchandise. But that has not yet happened. It seems evident that merely throwing different directors into the mix has made matters worse. It may be that the best way to make Star Wars great again is to let it rest for a while, perhaps for as long as a decade. And at a future time, a new generation of kids could grow to love it. For me at least, Star Wars died in 1983.